Hello, and welcome to another episode of Smart Talk. My name is Mansa, and today I'm going to be talking about our perspective for women's liberation in the neocolonial world. This episode is part of what I'm calling the Women in Revolution series, where I'm taking listeners through the key articles in our newly published journal by the same name. And no, don't worry, Smart Talk is not just about promoting women in revolution. So this episode is based on the back page article of the issue, which is called Anti-Imperialism and Women's Liberation. When it comes to the woman question in the neocolonial world, there's very little that's intelligent in terms of what the left says. At best, you'll have abstract calls for struggle and revolution, and why capitalism can't solve the problem, and why socialism is the only way to emancipate women. Now, these are all true things, but they're also utterly meaningless and convince nobody to become a Marxist. I mean, just think about it. If your perspective is to build real revolutionary parties in oppressed countries, you're going to need to win some working women, some peasant women. You're not going to win them with such abstractions. The way you will win them, however, is by actually explaining what's wrong with the existing choices, and then offering a path of struggle to advance their interests in the here and now. But I also want to insist on something further. And that is that first, what's essential is also to be able to understand what is the problem. That is, we need to be able to pose a correct political question. So, okay, we can talk generally that the condition of women in oppressed countries is much worse. But again, this is too general to be meaningful. As Marxists, as historical materialists, we need to put the question concretely in the political epoch that we're in. Because only by doing so can we then begin to understand the contradictions, as well as the illusions that they generate in the minds of individuals. And from there, we can then proceed to undercutting these illusions and counterposing a Marxist perspective. So all of this to say that this article begins by posing the actual political question. So simply, it's that in countries oppressed by imperialism, the woman question is trapped. It's trapped in a dynamic of relative progress and reversal and reaction. There's, if you will, one step forward and two steps back. In many countries, there have been important periods of progress that have brought women into the public sphere and integrated them into society. At the same time, all manner of backward pre-capitalist practices against women persist, and often decades of progress are reversed in the span of a few years. This is not a theoretical proposition, but it's actually concrete reality. And the task of communists is to figure out what gives rise to this dynamic and how do we break out of it in order to push forward the struggle for women's liberation. Let me paint a picture of this dynamic. So in Afghanistan, the Soviet-allied People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or the PDPA, enacted radical social reforms. But in doing so, it fueled an Islamist backlash that rode to power with the backing of the US. Later, when the US bombed Afghanistan in 2001 and installed the Karzai puppet regime, which proceeded to enact some pro-women measures, in doing so, basically fueled the Taliban, which rallied its forces in opposition to imperialism. And now that the Taliban is power, it's forced women back into the home. Okay, let's look elsewhere. Let's look at Iran. After a period of social modernization where women's rights were advanced, the mullahs came to power in 1979, throwing back the advancement that women had experienced, forcing women under the veil. Let's look elsewhere. Let's look at India. It's home to one of the largest pools of women in work and education, which is, objectively a good thing. Yet today in India, you have an openly Hindu chauvinist regime that upholds traditional conservative family values, and it resents the notion of women becoming independent. Let's look at a different continent altogether. In Argentina, you've had a period with strong feminist movements, yet today women are confronting devastating attacks by Milei, including on abortion rights. Now, you can go on and on. There are countless other examples that show this dynamic of advance and reversal time and time again. So we need to ask ourselves, why is it that progress hits this limit? And how do we break out of this dynamic and chart a course to take women's struggles forward? These, I think, are the decisive questions that the left needs to be grappling with and trying to provide answers for. And that's the purpose of our intervention with this article. What we do is we try and make some fundamental points regarding the woman question in oppressed countries. And the points are as follows, which I'll spend the rest of this episode elaborating. Number one, any struggle must be based on an opposition to imperialism. Number two, It must not be premised on supporting the national bourgeoisie, no matter how progressive it presents itself to be. And number 3, it must rely on the working class. To illustrate these points, the article offers a few examples of the various pitfalls that the struggle for women's rights falls into. Now, of course, there's a lot more to be said. For example, going over, different examples and showing how progressive nationalists are an obstacle to advancing women's liberation, etc. But this will be the task of a future article. For now, we want to get into the key points of this article. That is mostly to motivate why the women's struggle in the neocolonial world must be anti-imperialist. So I want to talk about the first section, which is the woman question and imperialism. The main point I make here is that the woman question cannot be understood independently from social development, because the conditions and rights of women in any given society are a reflection of the degree of social and economic development of that society. Marx explained it in his critique of the Gotha program, and he said, "A right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development which this determines." What this basically means is that in order to understand the limits to progress for women in oppressed countries, we need to understand the factors that actually act as a brake on the overall development of such countries. So what is that? Well, let's just look historically. Colonial expansion imposed capitalist social relations upon pre-capitalist societies. This process undermined the material basis of the old societies by introducing elements of modernization. This led to some degree of industrialization, urbanization, all of which prepared the ground for the integration of women into the proletariat, and which also chipped away at the old prejudices about women remaining at the home. So you find examples of women workers in textile mills and factories throughout colonial South and Southeast Asia. At the same time, colonialism was just sheer naked plunder of the colonies. Any socially progressive developments were the byproduct of a reactionary process whereby raw materials and wealth were pillaged and transferred to the metropolis. Now, this choked and impoverished the colonies, but also it encouraged the persistence of archaic social structures and practices. So even when these structures became economically anachronistic, the colonial masters fomented them as a mechanism of social control. So, for example, throughout Africa, you had the integration of traditional chiefs into the colonial administrations. In India, for example, you had the parasitical aristocrats that were basically, nurtured by the British. Now, today, even though colonial empires are gone, the plunder of the former colonies continues through their economic strangulation by Wall Street and US-dominated institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF, all of which are backed, of course, by the military might of US imperialism. So what you have is the export of imperialist finance capital to all corners of the earth for the express purpose of extracting super profits, which keep the poor countries completely impoverished. Now, I think one of the most recent and most glaring examples is the complete economic collapse of Sri Lanka in 2022, of really what such strangulation and impoverishment can look like. So like colonialism, modern imperialist oppression also puts fundamental limits on the level of development of poor nations, and in doing so, it reproduces daily what Marx called pre-capitalist muck. So what this results in is a permanent reservoir of conservative social forces and reactionary practices that can be rallied at any moment to defend, so-called traditional values, which end up forming the spearhead of attacks against women. So in order to combat conservative social reaction that strives to roll back any gains that women have made, it's necessary to attack the material foundations that give rise to such conservatism. And that material base is the imperialist oppression of the entire nation. So from all of this, there's a basic political conclusion that follows, which is that in order to fight for the advancement of women, it must be part of fighting for the overall development of society, which can then only happen in opposition to imperialist subjugation. So that was point one. Point two, and this is about the national bourgeoisie. Now, one of the main agents to which women turn to demand improvements in their conditions is the national bourgeoisie. Whether you have the Congress Party in India historically, whether you have the Kemalist parties in Turkey, or the left populist parties of Latin America, the ruling classes of oppressed countries can sometimes present themselves as a modernizing and secular force for social progress. However, no matter how radical or progressive they may appear, the problem is that they seek to tackle the overall, problem of underdevelopment and social backwardness within the strict limits imposed by their propertied class interests. What this means is that these national bourgeoisies have an interest in developing and modernizing their countries to increase their own power. In doing so, they need to push back against imperialist pillage of their own countries. However, at the same time, what they fear more than anything is the revolutionary potential of the masses. Therefore, because they fear this, the reforms that they are able to enact or are willing to enact are imposed bureaucratically, because doing so limits the direct involvement of the masses, and also fundamentally it leaves intact the actual material economic roots of underdevelopment of the nation and therefore of women's oppression. So to understand the dynamic fueling the reactionary cycles that keep women downtrodden, we again should go back to Marx and his quote that I mentioned earlier, that right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development that this determines. So basically what that means is that the meaningful extension and exercise of legal rights requires a sufficient economic basis. So modernizing or pro-women reforms enacted by the so-called progressive bourgeoisie can provide short-term relief for women, but without attacking the social roots of backwardness, such reforms will ultimately lay the basis for the growth of reaction. Because without a broader radical democratic and social revolution that can free the nation from imperialist oppression, that can solve the underdevelopment of the countryside, that can provide real social development, any kind of democratic progress or improvement in the condition of women will be temporary and it will be reversible. Ultimately, what's needed to address the burning needs of the masses, including women, is to raise the level of development of the nation as a whole. And again, because the national bourgeoisie, because its material role, it is fundamentally interested in keeping intact the status quo. So in order to take forward the nation, to take forward the struggle for women's advancement, these struggles can only go forward by rejecting any form of reliance on the national bourgeoisie. So this brings me to point number 3. Now, point 1 and 2, what they've done is we've made a case that it must be in opposition to imperialism, and it must be based on not supporting the national bourgeoisie. What those 2 points are, they flow from a basic materialist premise regarding the women question in oppressed countries. And that premise is that the woman question is tied to the overall level of social development, which is arrested, that is, held back by imperialist oppression, and which the national bourgeoisie is unable to decisively confront. So this brings us to the broader question, which is, okay, if you can't look to, the nice liberals in the West, if you can't look to the national bourgeoisie, no matter how progressive, where should the women's movement turn? Who are its allies in the struggle to achieve social development? And obviously for us, the answer is simple. The ally is the proletariat. Because simply the same national oppression and social backwardness that bears down on women also crushes the proletariat. The proletariat has no interest whatsoever in conciliating either imperialism or the national bourgeoisie, and it has every interest in joining its own emancipation to that of women. Not least because women form a crucial part of the working class and peasantry. Now, while the proletariat has an objective interest in championing the fight for women's liberation, this doesn't mean that it's a willing ally or automatically that it has socially progressive ideas on the women question. And I think we all know that the reality is often men from the working class and the poor peasantry will have regressive views towards women. Now, you just need to look around. Machismo is rampant in many countries of Latin America. In many Muslim countries, there is an expectation that women will cover themselves to maintain their modesty outside the home. And the list goes on. Such backward views act as an obstacle to building lasting unity between men and women workers. It makes women workers wary of their natural ally and instead turns them towards other political avenues. Now, this is, of course, a problem, but nonetheless, the material interests of the proletariat mean that it is actually politically possible to forge unity. Now, of course, this is concrete in terms of how this will be done, but the key to uniting the toilers of the poor nations is to first oppose imperialism and any force that conciliates it, and two, base the struggles of women toilers on the historic interests of the proletariat. So with these 3 points, we've sought to provide a perspective that can break through the cycle of reaction and advance the struggles of women in oppressed countries. The current state of rollbacks for women across the world is the clearest proof that women's struggles have not been on the right course. In fact, they have predominantly been on the entirely wrong track of either looking to imperialism or accommodating it. Now, in the rest of this episode, I want to go through 3 concrete examples to illustrate why that strategy is a complete dead end. And I want to then try and motivate our perspective in counterposition to that. So the first is just what I call liberal imperialist preaching. Now, of course, the world situation is changing rapidly. The return of Trump has really signaled a blow to liberalism. But nonetheless, this trend, which I call liberal imperialist preaching, it really has dominated the women's movement, I think, in the last 30-odd years, ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it is important for revolutionaries to be able to understand what was wrong with this trend and to draw lessons from it in order to move forward. So what is this? Basically what this trend is that many women, as they seek to alleviate their conditions, as they seek to push back against their oppression, when many women look to Western NGOs as allies in tackling anti-women bigotry. But at the heart of NGO work is the ideology of carrying out missionary work and civilizing the wretched nations and their people on behalf, however, of those forces that are actually responsible for keeping them in a state of wretchedness. Now, nothing could be more dangerous than this. So you have in many parts of Africa, NGOs carrying out campaigns to end backward practices. You have Ebola, for example, which I'll come to in a second. But the methods of the liberal NGOs, they're based on preaching against backwardness, because by design, the NGOs have no intention to, nor are they able to, attack the material basis of underdevelopment that continues to give rise to such practices. Now, of course, we're not here to deny that all manner of anti-women practices exist, but opposition to them is used in a completely hypocritical way by the liberal imperialist bourgeoisie in order to enhance its own ideological influence, in order to economically dominate the poor countries. So as a result, such liberal preaching to, be more woke, be more enlightened, ends up fueling a reaction by traditionalist forces who then rally against imperialism because they want to defend their, quote, traditional practices as part of defending their cultural values from Western liberal influence. Let me make this a little bit concrete. So we have here the case of South Africa and Ebola, which is the bride price. So many liberals and NGOs in South Africa oppose the Amakosi, which is a traditional chieftaincy, on the basis that this chieftaincy enshrines practices like the bride price or Ebola. Now, the liberal feminist argument is that since men pay for their brides, the practice of lobola empowers them to treat women as their property, and this fuels a maltreatment of women. This view, however, evokes the ire of a wing of the petty bourgeois black nationalists who then defend the Amakosi and related practices as part of defending the nation. So, for example, several years ago, in responding to the liberals and feminists who were opposing the traditional courts bill, this was a bill that granted more power to the chieftaincy, the former president, Jacob Zuma, lashed out saying, and I quote, "Let us solve African problems the African way, not the white man's way." So this allowed Jacob Zuma to basically grandstand against liberals and appeal to the anti-imperialist sentiments of the black masses. And this really did strike a chord with broad social layers because it's viewed as an expression of standing up to those who have pillaged the entire continent. So in this way, by just denouncing backwardness, what liberalism ends up doing is it ends up binding the oppressed ever more to the black nationalist elites who themselves actually conciliate imperialism and play an overall reactionary role by blocking social development. So in this way, the fight to end backwardness against women stays in this loop of liberalism on the one side, which ends up provoking a nationalist reaction, which only then makes the feminist reaction more hysterical, which only makes the nationalists more crazy. And you end up in this like crazy loop, which ends up polarizing the masses on the basis of who's more liberal, who's more backward. Now, this obviously is a huge obstacle to uniting the oppressed and struggle against imperialism. What this does is it actually polarizes the masses on completely wrong lines, completely liberal bourgeois lines of who's got better ideas, who's got worse ideas. Of course, we don't agree with those ideas, but the point is you're not gonna get rid of backwardness and backward ideas just through preaching them away, just to be like, oh look, you're bad. So the real question is, what is a proletarian approach to ending backward practices? Now, again, the whole explanation I've been making so far is that the very fact that these practices exist, that they persist, is a result of imperialist subjugation of poor nations and the inability of the local national bourgeoisies to resolve basic democratic tasks. Therefore, what this means is that any attempt to eliminate backward practices actually necessitates a struggle against the entire social fabric that maintains such practices. So, against liberal preaching, fighters for women's liberation, fighters against backward anti-women practices need to win working men to their struggle by linking it with their own national and social emancipation. They should not be driving working men farther away by telling them how backward they are. This is just completely counterproductive. So again, you can only build a unity by basing it on an opposition to the actual material cause of national and social oppression. Now, the second concrete example I want to talk about is a more radical, more militant, shall we say, version of liberal imperialism. And I've called this section Imperialist Bombs Against Women's and National Oppression. Now, one of the main ideological justifications for the US bombing of Afghanistan was the defense of women. And modern Afghanistan really shows most graphically how the woman question is trapped between these two reactionary poles. In this case, on the one hand, it's pro-imperialist liberalism and anti-imperialist Islamic fundamentalist reaction, both terrible, terrible ideas. Now, that the imperialist concern for Afghan women was worse than a lie and a sham is plain for everyone to see. The US fled in 2021 after a 20-year war, and the Taliban now oppresses women evermore. And it's simply reactionary to think, even for one fraction of a second, that US imperialism, which is a main force responsible for havoc in the entire Muslim world, is capable of delivering social progress for the oppressed. Whatever pro-women social reforms are made by US-backed regimes are often undermined and attacked by the coming to power of Islamist reaction, which then uses the defense of the nation in order to rally conservative social forces. The very presence of US imperialism in the region prevents any prospect of lasting social development. Now, Afghanistan is kind of a more obvious case of why the US's concern for women is a complete sham. The situation, however, is a little bit more complicated a few borders away in the Kurdish region. that experienced a national democratic uprising by the Kurds in 2012, known as the Rojava Revolution. Kurdish women played a central role in this uprising, taking up arms in the cause of their national and social emancipation. These events had tremendous potential to become a beacon for broader democratic struggles in the region. Now, there's a big problem, however, and that is that this, quote, revolution became completely subordinated to the interests of US imperialism in the region. This alliance ended up alienating and isolating the cause of Kurdish national liberation from other nationalities and groups in the region that are also being crushed by the US and its allies. Now, we explained in a recent article on the fall of Assad in Syria that it was one thing to accept help from the US and be in an objective alliance when the Kurds faced the threat of ethnic extermination. This was the case in the 2014 siege of Kobane by ISIS forces. However, it was quite another matter to launch a joint offensive with US troops in territories inhabited overwhelmingly by Arabs. For example, the large-scale devastation brought down on cities like Raqqa by the US with the help of Kurdish forces ended up only fostering more resentment. Now, when heroic women take up arms, they're being driven by a desire to fight for their national and social liberation. But the ultimate danger is to think that this can be advanced by relying on imperialism. The sights of armed Kurdish women are impressive, and they certainly show how empowered they are in relation to those who face far more impressive conditions. However, guns alone cannot address their national and social oppression. What they need actually is a strategy based on proletarian anti-imperialism that can break down the barriers between Kurdish and other peoples in the region. Now, since we wrote this article, what we've had is the open capitulation of Öcalan and the SDF, that they have down their arms and they have said that they will basically merge with the military of al-Jilani. Why has this happened after over a decade of armed resistance? Well, I think this is the logical outgrowth of their subordination to imperialism. Now, what's the basic point here? Which is that colonial empires and imperialism have carved up whole regions. And what they did is that they divided entire peoples. But in the process, what this also did was it intertwined their destinies. In a region such as the Middle East, one nation simply cannot go forward in isolation from the others and without trampling on the rights of the others. So the future of the Middle East lies in a united struggle against imperialism, based on championing the democratic rights of women, minority religions, and oppressed nations. So for Kurdish women, to advance their struggle against their national and social oppression, what they must do is they must emerge as the true champions of the liberation of all toilers in the region. For this to happen, first and foremost, they need to break their alliance with US imperialism. Now, the last concrete example I want to go over is a women life freedom movement in Iran over the last couple of years. So what this was in 2022, Gina Amini was accused of violating the reactionary codes of modesty imposed by the Iranian mullahs. Why? What did she do? She showed some hair under her veil. And for doing so, she was taken into custody by the regime's morality police, and later she died under extremely suspicious circumstances. This state-sanctioned murder was a spark that ignited the Women Life Freedom mass movement that brought into the streets those who were fed up with the clerical regime in Iran. One of the main demands of this movement was to oppose the imposition of the veil and to be for secularism. Now, this broad resentment against the mullahs drew in all the different layers and political trends from Iranian society and the diaspora. And support ranged from those on the left, to the oppressed Kurdish and Balochi national minorities, to liberal human rights activists, to feminists of many different stripes, to openly reactionary pro-imperialist elements like Reza Pahlavi, the exiled crown prince of Iran, and his cabal of monarchist supporters, and of course, US imperialism itself. So this is a broad movement. Now, of course, the movement had left-wing and anti-monarchist elements as well. But the truth is that these elements were subordinate. That is, they were beholden to the liberals who took the leadership of the movement based on the fight for human rights and gender rights. What this did is, objectively, it aligned the movement with the aims of the monarchist and imperialist reaction, that sought to use this movement to push an anti-Iran agenda under the guise of pushing secularism and democracy. You had a keynote address at the Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy in February 2025, where Reza Pahlavi, the Crown Prince of Iran, who's in exile, he stated, and I quote, "The Iranian people have endured more than 4 decades of suffering, yet their spirit remains unbroken. They're fighting not just for themselves, but for the values of freedom, justice, and human dignity." End quote. And even Biden, on the first anniversary of Gina Amini's death, had the audacity to say the following, and I quote, "She inspired a historic movement, Women, Life, Freedom, that has impacted Iran and influenced people across the globe who are tirelessly advocating for gender equality and respect for their human rights." End quote. The democratic demands of the movement reflected in some deformed manner the aspirations of the masses, especially women. However, in the hands of the monarchists and imperialists, these very same demands were used as a spearhead to oppress Iran and crush its resistance to US imperialism. These demands and the oppression of women are therefore wielded for utterly reactionary aims. As a result, the struggles of Iranian women were alienated from the layers of conservative Shia masses who see the Iranian regime as a fighter against US imperialism. So the inability of the movement to pierce through this nationalist and anti-imperialist consciousness of the Shia working class meant that the movement actually, in fact, pushed certain layers farther into the arms of the mullahs and eventually ended up isolating itself on the road to a gradual defeat. So what should the movement have done? Of course, it was necessary to stand against the regime and use the economic and democratic grievances of the masses, but this alone was not enough. In order to effectively undermine the regime, without conceding a single inch to imperialism, it was necessary to win over those layers in the working class who are loyal to the regime and who see the regime as a reflection of their resistance against imperialist pillage. But you can only do this if you're able to take on the regime's strongest argument, and that is that this regime is a beacon of Muslim resistance against Western aggression. The way you're going to do this is by showing that this regime actually alienates national minorities, religious minorities, it alienates youth, it alienates women and workers. And in doing so, it actually undermines the unity of the masses against imperialism, and therefore acts as a huge obstacle to advancing the anti-imperialist struggle. So, by fusing the struggle for democratic and social liberation, such a strategy would have allowed the movement to use anti-imperialist impulses of the Shia working class against the regime, opening the road for a struggle against both imperialism as well as the mullahs. This is what was needed. But the movement didn't have this kind of a perspective, and therefore it was totally open to being co-opted by the liberal imperialist elements, and it isolated itself. And this movement, I think, is one of the clearest examples of how the fight against women's oppression and for democratic rights is actually a powerful motor force for revolution in the neocolonies, but also how it cannot succeed without a proletarian anti-imperialist perspective. Now, I'm going to start to wrap up. So, what was the aim here? The whole aim of this article was to put forward some fundamental arguments for why the struggle for women's liberation in the neocolonial world must be anti-imperialist, and to actually go through some examples and trends to show how the various programs and methods of women's struggles, so long as they stay on a liberal track, end up blocking the road to liberation. Central to our thesis has been the need for unconditional opposition to imperialism and all its conciliators. To insist on this one last time, I'll leave our readers, or listeners, with a word from Trotsky. He writes, this is from an article called Lenin on Imperialism from February 1939. It's quite a nice article. I recommend you guys read it. He writes, quote, "Imperialism camouflages its own peculiar aims, the seizure of colonies, markets, sources of raw material, spheres of influence, with such ideas as safeguarding peace against the aggressors, defense of the fatherland, defense of democracy, etc. These ideas are false through and through. It is the duty of every socialist not to support them, but, on the contrary, to unmask them before the people." End quote. To this list of camouflages of imperialism, we must add the fight for women's rights. So this was our article, Anti-Imperialism and Women's Liberation. You can always go online to iclfi.org to read or download a copy or to subscribe to our press. And I'll leave you guys here. Until next time, bye.